Something massive shifted in the American economy over the last few days, and the official statements coming out of Washington are completely blind to it. The headlines are burying the real story, but the truth is stark. The jobs are leaving. Not gradually, not in waves, but all at once. 500,000 paychecks wiped out in a sudden, violent structural contraction. This is not a standard economic correction, and it is not a routine market cycle. This is a full-blown structural alarm sounding from deep within the engine room of the world's largest economy. Most people are still oblivious, but you are about to feel the heat. Because underneath the polished unemployment figures and the Treasury Department's promises of a fourth quarter recovery, we are witnessing a catastrophic collision between political theory and brutal economic reality. Welcome to Global Truth Pulse, your premier hub for deep-dive geopolitical and macroeconomic analysis. If you want to understand the hidden forces shaping our world before they hit your bank account, you are in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this broadcast. The mainstream media will not break down what is actually happening to the global order, but we will. The grand theory sold to the public was simple and seductive. Weaponize tariffs, punish foreign imports, force manufacturing back to American soil, and protect domestic jobs. The logic assumed that if foreign inputs cost more, companies would buy local, factories would hire, and hollowed-out industrial towns would instantly revitalize. But this theory fundamentally misunderstood how the modern economy is built. American manufacturing does not operate in a vacuum. It is irreversibly embedded in complex global supply chains. The steel, the aluminum, and the microcomponents that go into American-made products come from everywhere. Taxing these crucial inputs does not protect domestic factories. It slaps an aggressive tax directly on them, compressing their margins and destroying their competitiveness. When costs skyrocket and sales plummet, businesses do not hire, they cut. To fully understand this unraveling, we must dissect this economic crisis across three distinct, overlapping front lines that are simultaneously crushing the American workforce. The first front line is the manufacturing and logistics bloodbath. Recent federal data and supply chain surveys reveal that the American manufacturing sector has been trapped in a continuous contraction for 10 consecutive months, with the Purchasing Managers Index sinking deep below the critical threshold that separates growth from decay. The pattern of winners and losers is the exact opposite of what policymakers promised. While a tiny island of primary metal producers added a handful of jobs, the massive downstream sectors that actually power the economy, the machinery makers, computer manufacturers, and transportation equipment producers, experienced catastrophic losses. Industrial giants have been forced to absorb hundreds of millions of dollars in tariff-related costs, leading to plummeting operating profits and immediate mass layoffs across the Midwest. The automotive sector alone cut thousands of jobs, while the transportation and warehousing sector shed over 100,000 positions from its peak. A decline that official labor reports confirm is actively worsening. Let us look closely at how this private sector decay manifests in real-world boardrooms and factory floors. When a global agricultural equipment giant acknowledges hundreds of millions of dollars in tariff-related operational headwinds, it is not a hypothetical baseline. It translates instantly into slashed profit margins, frozen capital investments, and the sudden termination of hundreds of workers at plants across Illinois and Iowa. When major automakers cite trade friction as the direct catalyst for thousands of job cuts, it proves that the very industries tariffs were meant to shield are the ones bleeding out. The logistics network, which acts as the nervous system of the economy, registers this pain immediately. A continuous reduction of over 100,000 jobs in transportation and warehousing signals that fewer physical goods are moving through ports, fewer trucks are filling highways, and fewer fulfillment centers are operating at capacity. This is the invisible friction of a trade war, operating exactly as economists predicted, but policymakers ignored. The second front line is the unprecedented gutting of the public sector under the banner of government efficiency. At the exact moment, tariffs were draining private sector employment. An aggressive, centralized cost-cutting drive was launched in Washington. Government efficiency teams aggressively eliminated over 200,000 federal civilian positions in a matter of months, drastically overshooting their own initial budget targets without congressional authorization or regulatory transparency. This massive workforce reduction wiped out nearly 10% of the federal civilian workforce before the fiscal year even got underway. The internal devastation is staggering. The revenue agencies are cutting massive portions of their staff. Public health agencies responsible for disease outbreaks lost a tenth of their workforce, and crucial meteorological and oceanographic agencies cut over 1,000 workers, threatening the weather forecasting infrastructure that agriculture, aviation, and emergency logistics heavily rely on. The geographic concentration of these public sector cuts has transformed prosperous regional economies into immediate economic casualty zones. Consider the deep impact on states heavily anchored by the federal apparatus. One state alone witnessed the erasure of over 20,000 federal jobs in less than a year, completely wiping out 6 full years of sustained public sector employment growth. This sudden removal of stable paychecks acts like a localized economic black hole. The damage does not stop at the agency gates. It cascades instantly into the surrounding community. The housing markets freeze, small businesses lose their daily foot traffic, and municipal tax revenues collapse, directly starving local schools and essential public services of vital funding. When stable, long-term government roles that families relied upon for generations disappear overnight. Consumer confidence in those regions dies a quiet death. This is how a centralized push for bureaucratic reduction transforms into a hyper-localized commercial depression. The third front line is the devastating double squeeze on the American consumer. The average household has been forced to pay an additional $1,700 in direct annual costs purely attributable to these sweeping tariffs. The vast majority of citizens report that everyday items, groceries, clothing, electronics, and household supplies have become severely less affordable because import costs are ruthlessly passed from importer to retailer to consumer. Layered directly on top of this artificial inflation is a massive global energy shock triggered by the ongoing war in the Persian Gulf. Gas prices have surged 30% in recent weeks, adding heavy surcharges to airline tickets, shipping fees, and agricultural fertilizers. A family already struggling to absorb tariff inflation is now paying premium prices just to heat their homes, fuel their cars, and buy basic groceries, all while their primary breadwinners face a highly unstable job market. This structural compression of the consumer base strikes directly at the primary driver of national economic activity. When 60 to 70% of economic growth relies entirely on domestic consumer spending, attacking the consumer's wallet from two sides simultaneously is a recipe for systemic stagnation. Families are no longer debating discretionary luxury purchases. They are actively calculating how to scale back on core necessities. The compounding effects of higher pump prices and inflated retail goods mean that every dollar spent on survival is a dollar taken away from the broader service economy. Retailers, already facing compressed margins from their own rising import costs, cannot afford a prolonged drop in consumer traffic. This creates an incredibly fragile environment where any further increase in energy or commodity costs will directly force service sector businesses to initiate their own defensive wave of labor cuts. When we pull back the curtain and look at the global chessboard, it becomes clear that this is no longer just a trade war or an internal government restructuring drive. It is a dangerous convergence of multiple macroeconomic shocks hitting the exact same economy at the exact same time. More industries are actively cutting jobs than adding them, a specific trend line that historically only manifests when an economy has already entered a recession. The broader economy is not adding jobs fast enough to absorb the hundreds of thousands of workers being displaced by these rapid policy shifts. In fact, total annual layoff announcements have surged by more than 50%, reaching the highest levels witnessed since the global financial crisis and the height of the pandemic. 2/3 of internal supply chain professionals are now openly declaring that a formal economic recession is not a distant threat, but a current reality. The international dimension of this crisis amplifies the domestic pain exponentially. The conflict in the Persian Gulf, which was structurally predicted by optimistic defense planners to last a mere 4 to 6 weeks, has now dragged past 2 full months with absolutely no resolution or diplomatic off-ramp in sight. This protracted military standoff locks high energy costs into the global supply chain permanently, inflating the cost of international container shipping and domestic freight transportation simultaneously. At the same time, the administration's combative stance toward traditional trading partners has disrupted long-standing industrial alliances. The global economy is reacting to these combined pressures by fragmenting into protective regional blocs, which further reduces the efficiency of just-in-time manufacturing and leaves domestic producers increasingly isolated from cost-effective international inputs. Over the next 30 days, this economic strain will face a series of compounding geopolitical pressures that will dictate whether the situation stabilizes or spirals into a historic crisis. Washington is facing a critical review of regional trade agreements, and international partners like Canada have already spent months diversifying their trade networks and building strong partnerships with China, giving them far more leverage at the negotiating table than Western strategy anticipated. Simultaneously, the Middle East conflict remains highly volatile, locking energy prices at damaging highs. Amidst this chaos, the Federal Reserve is trapped in a classic monetary vice, under intense political pressure to slash interest rates to salvage cooling economic growth, yet fully aware that tariff-driven inflation has not yet subsided, making any premature easing incredibly risky. The vulnerability of the current administrative strategy lies in its absolute reliance on factors completely outside its sphere of control. Policymakers have repeatedly deflected immediate labor market concerns by promising a massive systemic economic acceleration by the final quarter of the year. However, this projected turnaround requires every single geopolitical wildcard to break perfectly in Washington's favor. It requires foreign adversaries to capitulate unconditionally on trade terms, Middle Eastern combatants to agree to an immediate, stable ceasefire, and global supply chains to seamlessly reorganize themselves overnight, without creating secondary inflationary spikes. If even one of these volatile dynamics fails to cooperate, the official timeline for recovery completely disintegrates, leaving the domestic economy exposed to prolonged structural decline. The best-case scenario relies entirely on moving parts that Washington cannot fully control. A high-stakes bilateral summit producing immediate trade stabilization, an urgent ceasefire bringing energy costs down, and domestic businesses quickly adapting to the tariff regime to resume hiring. The worst-case scenario is a dangerous, self-reinforcing economic spiral. If compressed consumer spending finally triggers widespread layoffs in the massive retail and service sectors, unemployment could breach the critical threshold that turns a severe strain into a deep, historic contraction. When an economy begins to contract structurally, the psychological shift among corporations and consumers becomes the ultimate driver of the downturn. If executives look at the ongoing trade friction and decide that cost pressures are permanent, they stop viewing layoffs as a temporary adjustment and start viewing them as a survival mechanism. This shifts the entire labor market from a state of localized friction to a systemic downward spiral. As more workers lose their incomes, aggregate demand drops further, validating corporate fears and triggering subsequent rounds of staff reductions across non-industrial sectors like healthcare, finance, and domestic retail. This is the exact transition point where policy-induced friction evolves into a self-sustaining organic recession that no amount of political rhetoric can easily reverse. 500,000 lost jobs is not an abstract statistic. It represents hundreds of thousands of people who woke up to find their financial security completely erased by an agenda that promised them absolute prosperity. These are real individuals and families forced to reconstruct their entire lives inside an economic landscape that has fundamentally changed its rules overnight without their consent. They are doing the hard, exhausting math at the kitchen table every single week, trying to figure out how to bridge the widening gap between stagnant or non-existent wages and the remorseless upward march of cost of living indicators. For these citizens, the theoretical promises of long-term national greatness offer no protection against the immediate reality of an empty bank account and an impending mortgage payment. So I leave you with a critical question to answer in the comments below. When the administration promised that aggressive tariffs would effortlessly revive domestic industry and protect working-class jobs, did you believe the theory then? And looking at the hard economic numbers over the past year, what does the reality tell you now? Is the current economic widespread strain merely a temporary bridge to an era of manufacturing dominance? Or are we witnessing the permanent fracturing of the consumer economy under the weight of flawed economic theories? If you want to maintain total clarity as the global order fractures and reshapes itself, make sure to subscribe to Global Truth Pulse, like this video, and share your insights below. We will be tracking these developments as they unfold. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next briefing.